Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's very special webinar. We are super excited about this webinar because it's based on a research project and a real collaborative, cooperative partnership with SFU, and we're thrilled. We're just thrilled. So my name's Amelia Shaw, and I am the Executive Manager of IAP2 Canada and the Event Coordinator for IAP2 USA. And on behalf of IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA and IAP2 Australasia, we really want to welcome you to this special webinar. As I said, we're excited about it. And as you can see from Elodie's smile, we know that Elodie and her team are also equally excited about this. We know that for many of you, we're all, well, actually worldwide, we're in times of COVID-19 right now. And we know for many of you that you're going through really different times and difficult times. And we just want to say that our heart goes out to you. We hope that you're all doing well, that you're all staying safe and healthy. And of course, as always, if there's anything IAP2 can do for you and your profession, please do let us know. But we just wanted to let you know that we're thinking of you and we're wishing you well. So wanted to start off with that. We also would like to start with a land recognition, a land acknowledgement. We are coming to you from East Souk, British Columbia, and we acknowledge with respect that it is on the ancestral land of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on southern Vancouver Island, signatories to the Douglas Treaties of 1850. Their traditional connection with the land continues to this day. And we're very excited today because we know that we've got almost 300 of you from around the world joining us. So we'd also like you to pause for just a few, maybe a minute or so, just to truly reflect on the land that you're also on. Thank you for that. So we're going to get going. And so I get to introduce Elodie, Grace, and Nicole first. So I'll ask both Grace and Nicole to now show their video cameras so that as I'm introducing them, you can also see them. So Elodie Jacquet is the Manager of Knowledge and Practice at the Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue. She's helped design and facilitate large citizen engagement processes, such as the National Reconciliation Gatherings, the Citizens Dialogue on Canada's Energy Future, and dialogues on the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. She was also a peer reviewer for the 4th Open Government Plan for the Government of Canada and is a researcher for the Equity and Public Engagement process. And Elodie holds a Master's in Global Climate and Energy Policy for the University of London, United Kingdom. Grace Lee has led the Centre's signature events and engagement projects with diverse partners from different levels of governments, civil society organizations, and academic institutions. She has delivered projects on a variety of topics, including supporting women in conflict prevention, human rights, and climate change, and the inclusion in public engagement consultation process. And both Elodie and Grace are joined by Nicole. Nicole Armos works to expand the knowledge and practice of dialogue and public engagement by coordinating research and knowledge and exchange initiatives at SFU's Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue. Since 2013, Nicole has supported local government, provincial, and federal public engagement projects, specializing in data analysis, reporting, and evaluation. So I'm going to let Elodie tell you a little bit more about this exciting initiative, but I must tell you that IAP2 is really thrilled to be in partnership with SFU on this. I think we helped kickstart an initiative, and then the initiative exploded, which is really fabulous. So Elodie, it's with extreme pleasure that I now turn it over to yourself, Nicole, and Grace.
Thank you, Amelia, for this lovely introduction. And I have to say, it has been a very fruitful collaboration with IAP2. We've been longtime supporters of IAP2's work, and we try to attend all the North American conferences whenever we can. And it's always been a pleasure to interact with all the members, practitioners, and to see the excellent work coming out from our different members. So as Amelia mentioned, this project started about 2 years ago, I want to say now, when IAP2 commissioned a research paper on inclusion in public participation and public engagement. So as she mentioned, our senior research associate, Nicole, myself, and Grace, along with our fellow in diversity and innovation, Dr. Robert Dahm, we embarked on a comprehensive literature review, and we came up with the research paper that is now published on IAP2's website. And we were very intrigued when we were going through this research. We found a lot, and there were also many, many more questions. And we tried to use a principles-based approach because we understand that in public engagement, there are no silver bullets. There are no templates that you can just paste onto any engagement. So we use an approach based on principles, which we think can then be adapted and be contextualized to whatever type of work you might be doing as practitioners. So once this research paper was done, we shared it with a number of our colleagues at the university and also amongst practitioners that we work with. And they also had questions. So we then thought, well, we have a little bit of money, which is very rare for a university, and Grace will speak a little bit to that, but we have a beautiful endowment at the Center for Dialogue that we were able to use to then embark in a 1.5 year long process of deep dive research. So this is where Grace will explain some of the process we went through, but coming out of this long research process that felt, like I mentioned to Amelia, like a very long labor of love, we produced this new guide for practitioners called Beyond Inclusion, and it looks at inclusion, but it also looks at questions of equity and public engagement. And the reason why this was important to us is we are sort of a think and do tank at the Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue, and we have a deep interest in democracy, democratic resiliency, and how we can support communities to better participate in decision-making processes, just as most of you working in this field are. So the idea behind it was, how do we support this democratic resilience? And one of the findings that we had in this research is that equity is really important to that. And it makes sense. If your communities are not engaged, if they're not participating in your democracy, then you start having a problem. And I think this is where our reflection really comes to light, and this is what really deeply interests us. So how do we enable different communities, different groups to actively participate in our democratic processes, whatever they can be? You know, it's beyond voting. It's really thinking about, even at your neighborhood level, how do communities engage with their neighborhoods? How do they create a sense of belonging in these diverse communities that they are a part of? And we know from other research we've done on democratic engagement that that sense of belonging is really important to democratic resiliency. So feeling that you belong to your community, to your municipality, to your neighborhood, to your country, that is a clear indicator of how well your country will do in terms of being democratically resilient. So I insist on that a lot because we tend to focus on inclusion as something you kind of have to do to make it work, and it's almost like a communications exercise. And I think it goes way beyond that. And I'm seeing more and more reflection on this from practitioners and from colleagues, and we're really excited by that. So in the next little bit, I'm going to invite my colleagues to really share some of the findings, but I wanted to set the stage for why we entered into this research and how it was linked to some of our other work. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Grace Lee, who leads our signature events and endowments portfolio, and who was very essential in helping us organize this research and develop a process that was both meaningful and useful. So I'm going to pass it on to Grace to tell us a little bit about why the process of doing the research was almost as important as the findings. Grace, take it away.
Thank you, Elodie. Hello, everybody. It's really, really exciting to be here to share this outcome with you. As Elodie said, we've been working on this for the last 1.5 years, and for the next 10 minutes or so, I'll try to share a snapshot of the process and some questions that we had to ask ourselves to go through our own engagement process in creating this resource. So at the center, we always ask this question: how do we get out of reaching the same 10 people over and over again? And as all of you know, there's no recipe for inclusion, and public engagement process needs to respond and adapt. So following the IAP2 research paper, we decided to build on the research and find community members to directly comment and validate the research that we did. So as a team, we sat down and started to talk about what is the right way to approach this project. And we had a lot of questions. Some of the questions were, what should be the framing of this focus group? Who should be the facilitators? Do we even have an adequate pool of diverse facilitators? As an institution, are we ready to let diverse facilitators be the face of our project? What kind of accessibility needs should we consider? How do we ensure diversity? So who do we invite? And realistically, with a very limited budget, what were the trade-offs? And this really deep framing exercise we did as a team taught us a lot about how to run an engagement, and really became the soil of the eight principles that you will see in a minute. And after hours and hours of consultations with experts, discussions within the team, you won't be surprised, we came to the conclusion that we will never get it right. There will never be one answer in how we serve different needs and how we prioritize different communities that needed to be on the table. So, and we also discussed that we needed real life cases on how different public engagement processes answered the question of inclusion and equity, because we believe that without it, the principles would not be practical. Ultimately, we really wanted this process itself to increase the capacity of those of us doing this work. So after a few versions of edits in the planning, we decided to convene 4 focus groups. And they were academic community table, public institutions and government, and 2 city-specific tables with mixed group of community members and service providers from each city. Then we created a matrix of outcomes and questions that we wanted answered from each specific audience. So how do these different groups assess the current state of inclusion and accessibility? How can we improve it? And what are the tools and resources that are currently available to us? And we asked each group to identify challenges as a convener or as a participant of a public engagement process, to analyze what were some of the shared themes that arose and existed across different groups. At the final dialogue that brought together everybody, we used these case studies that we harvested to co-create the final principles. Sometimes I believe the framing of a question and the process itself is as important as the outcome, as it defines the project. To create a sense of collaboration and nurture real relationships, you need to spend a lot of time in the beginning to define the right questions that you're trying to ask and whether you're even ready to ask that question. I see that in a lot of my projects, the community that was built along the way became the outcome itself. Another point that I really wanted to talk to you about today is how we did outreach. So from the beginning, it was really important that we did this in a meaningful way and not tokenize or just check a box. So from the get-go, this was one of the principles that was identified from doing the research with IAP2. We all know that focusing on meaningful relationship is one way to get diversity in the participants we engage and get good results. And thankfully, I had the privilege in my current role of engaging very diverse community members, in the topics that you heard earlier. So I started to pick up my phone and call people and ask them who should be on the table, like who needs to be involved in this discussion. And I bet as practitioners, we all have experiences of feeling insecure about a process that we're about to design and feel vulnerable about saying that we actually don't know what the answer is in how we are going to convene. But at the end, one of the ways that really diversified the participant group for this project specifically was by being open about the process. We worked with our past partners and solicited their ideas on how this process can better accommodate the community they serve. Then we asked our partners to identify in their community those who were passionate about this topic and to attend with them. So the community member with the partner organization staff. This really furthered our reach into communities that we usually don't serve. And in some cases ended up providing accessibility to those who would not be able to attend. So for example, there was a partner organization that works with a developmental disability community and runs their annual civic engagement. And a staff member from that organization was able to attend with an individual and ended up actually providing the support they needed to participate in the conversation. And I believe the key was finding the people who don't necessarily have the title of engagement, and creating a really low barrier entry for participation. After the initial process of the 4 focus groups dialogue with national and international policy experts of the open government and a regional workshop that actually brought together everybody, we wrote the first report. We were so excited and we shared it with our internal community. And to our surprise, we actually received a very strong critical feedback and pushback from the community of practitioners that we have at SFU. One of the biggest feedback was on the fact that we were not explicit on the Indigenous engagement and specific needs that that community has. And I saw myself becoming a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit defensive because I thought, hey, we did our homework, like we spent a year on this. Because in the beginning of this project, we had originally made the decision with our Indigenous fellow at the center to include and embed Indigenous perspectives in each of the sessions and each of the principles that we were going to write. And the Indigenous perspectives were woven through each principle rather than being an exclusive one. Because we all believed it was really important that that perspective was captured throughout the report. And after deliberation, there was we decided there was a strong value in further recognizing the specific rights that group had, and actually pivoted the plan to host an additional roundtable after the first initial report was done. And just to jump over, it made our research richer, and this is why you're seeing 8 principles and not 7, like in the original IAP2 research paper you saw. And my colleague Nicole in a bit will go deeper into the details of how it influenced our overall framework. I really wanted to share this story with you because I wanted to reiterate my point that there is not one right approach in inclusion. No matter how much you do your homework, there will always be room for improvement and you will get pushbacks. Sometimes you just need to pick up your phone and ask those who you are trying to engage how we should be engaging. And we learned through this process that the important thing is not getting it perfect, but that you're making room for feedback and that you're ready to pivot your project when feedback comes. And also it is important to solicit diverse point of views when creating your process in the beginning and not make the mistake of believing that you have done your homework or checked a box just because you consulted one expert. At the end of the Indigenous Roundtable, the group asked us what we were looking from them going forward. And we said, we need you to continue to keep us accountable. Because at first, it may make us feel uncomfortable to be in that space. But when we learn that we are all in this journey together, we might actually realize the feedback or critique that we're getting is actually a blessing in disguise. So with that, I'm really excited to flip it back to Elodie and share the principles with you.
Elodie, we can't hear you, so just and
there we go.
We might
Sorry about
also
that.
have. No worries. I think we also have some poll questions, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. I was just going to say that we wanted to, before we dive into the deep content, we wanted to find out, first of all, where all of you are joining from, because we're very curious to know where folks are coming from. So I think Drew had a little poll ready.
That's right. The poll is now up.
That's right.
So if people could just take about a minute just to let us know where you're coming from, and we'll find out who's on the call with you today, Elodie, Nicole, and Grace. All right, Drew, I think we can probably close that down. Let's see what we've got. All right, so 34% are from Manitoba West, 14% from Ontario East, 33% from west of the Mississippi in the United States, and 18% from east of the Mississippi. And for our Australasian colleagues, because we know that many of you will listen to this through the recording, we know that it's 2 a.m. there. So it's perfectly fine that you're not on the call today. So thanks. So back over to you, Elodie.
Yes, please do get some sleep for our friends in Oceania. I think before we dive into the actual content, we have a second poll, and this is more related to the content itself. We wanted to find out from all of you practitioners out there and experts, what are some of the major challenges that you're facing in terms of thinking about inclusion and equity in your practice? So again, I'll ask Drew if he can put that up. But these are some of the questions that we ran into, and we're really curious to see how it shows up in your practice.
Thanks very much, Elodie. So the poll is up there at the moment. What are some of the concerns you have about the inclusion and equity of your public engagements? A digital divide and accessibility overall, privacy concerns, outreach to participants, safety of participants, or fear of seeing the engagement hijacked. So hopefully you'll now be able to get in there. I understand that some people had issues in responding to the first poll, but hopefully this now works. All right, if people would like to respond, that'd be great. Drew, if you want to close that, and we'll see what the results are. So 89% for digital accessibility overall, 17% for privacy concerns, 70% for outreach to participants, 25% for safety of participants, and 28% for fear of seeing the engagement hijacked. So, apparently this poll worked fine. So hopefully everyone got an opportunity to vote this time. So Megan, thank you for letting us know about that. And I'm going to send it back to you.
So thank you for sharing some of those concerns, because they do kind of line up quite well with some of the principles that Nicole will be going through in just a minute. I do want to give a big shout out to Nicole, because this beautiful guide that some of you will be receiving, I think, along with the PowerPoint after the webinar, was entirely Nicole's writing. Nicole is one of our star writers at the center, and she's also an amazing researcher and analyst, and none of this would have been possible without her tears and sweat during this process. So I want to give her a big shout out for that. And I will pass this on to Nicole to tell us a little bit more about the principles that were developed and share some of the case studies.
Oh, thanks, Elodie, for such a warm welcome. It's been such a privilege for me to be a part of this project, because equity and inclusion is something that has always been very dear to me. As Grace was describing, after that initial period of research, the focus groups and roundtables that we hosted helped to expand our understanding of inclusion and equity in public engagement and refine that original set of principles we proposed in our research paper. As you were seeing in the previous slide, we added a couple got merged, but a lot of them were the same. One of the things that stood out to me was in our conversations, there were multiple layers or definitions or dimensions of research coming up in the way folks were talking about inclusion and equity. And, you know, the most immediate and apparent one that we often is the one that we evaluate is the diversity of participants in the room and the accessibility of the space or process. However, participants were also saying that it really matters whether decision makers are truly committed to incorporating and including that public input into their decision-making process. And further, they really emphasized the importance of systemic equity within institutions and society. So this includes how representatively diverse our staff and decision makers, and the degree of social equality within a community. As one participant said, it's nice to have freedom of expression, but if you don't have access to clean water or food, there can be no adequate participation. So this really expanded our vision of, you know, what does inclusion mean in public engagement to be a broader perspective on that. So for those of you who are familiar with the original 7 principles that we proposed in the research paper for IAP2, you'll notice that most of those were validated. However, we added 2 principles that more explicitly address that systemic level of inclusion, including that distinct principle related to our relationship with Indigenous peoples in our colonial context, as well as a call to advance systemic equity through engagement. And our final set of principles are designed to address all the dimensions that contribute to an inclusive process. So I'm not going to go through each of these principles and share just a few of the concrete strategies that can help us implement them on the ground from what we heard. So the first principle is reminding us to invite participation within an authentic and accountable engagement process. So 3 of the top themes we were hearing in the focus groups was the importance of authenticity, accountability, and transparency to rebuild the public's trust in engagement processes. Even if we have the most accessible engagement process, in order to draw people into the room, the public needs to know that their contributions are going to make a difference. And so this principle is particularly important to keep in mind when engaging with historically marginalized communities where trust may have eroded over years of not feeling heard or feeling even possibly over-consulted. Authentic and accountable engagement processes don't have predetermined conclusions or expected outcomes, and decision makers are genuinely interested in the public's input and responsive to what they hear. And ways to demonstrate this include clarifying and communicating our objectives. If we flip to the next slide just for a moment, we can use tools such as IAP2's spectrum of engagement to help us clarify whether the goal is merely to inform the public or to really co-create solutions or somewhere in between. And the more we are explicit and communicate that to the public, we have that level of trust. Maybe we are not always in the very participatory mode of engagement, but we need to be clear about that. Other ways we can demonstrate it include researching previous engagements to avoid duplication, avoid over-consulting, and respect the public's time. Also reporting back findings in a timely way and following up about long-term impact so that folks know where their input has gone. And when possible, involving communities in monitoring and implementing those findings so that they are involved not only in sharing the ideas, but in the long-term process of it. Principle 2 calls us to plan early and proactively. We need to design the entire engagement plan with the aim of maximizing inclusion and equity. This includes our budgets, the timelines, the framing, the communications, and the process design. As one participant said, diversity shouldn't be an afterthought. It requires careful planning, research, and critical thinking in order to identify and address gaps early on. We should also aim to anticipate and address potential barriers before they discourage participation or force people to advocate for themselves. A proactive approach involves dedicating time to building relationships and conducting sufficient outreach and allocating resources for accessibility measures. Now, we heard that unfortunately, time and resources is actually one of the biggest barriers practitioners face to designing inclusive engagement processes. But rushed and under-resourced engagements can cause more harm than good. So we really need to critically assess our objectives and our timelines and be realistic about what objectives we can actually deliver and what necessary trade-offs there are. The more we are, again, transparent about that with the public, that continues to build up that sense of trust, even if maybe it is a more limited engagement. The third principle of establishing respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples was designed primarily for a Canadian context in recognition of Indigenous peoples' ancestral ties to these lands and their inherent treaty, constitutional, and human rights. However, we do invite those of you who are joining us from outside of Canada to consider how this principle applies to your context, especially in other settler colonial states such as the United States, South America, the Caribbean, or Australasia. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has affirmed that Indigenous peoples hold an inherent right to self-determination, and the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples is required before the approval of legislation or projects affecting their rights, their lands, territories, or other resources. And additionally, in Canada, governments have a legal duty to consult Indigenous peoples around decisions that may affect their Aboriginal and treaty rights. So we realized that it was beyond the scope of our work to comment on the best way to fulfill this legal duty to consult. However, all engagement practitioners hold a responsibility to work in a spirit of reconciliation with in all our engagement processes, whether we are specifically engaging Indigenous peoples or whether we are engaging other communities on ancestral Indigenous territories. We can enact this responsibility in different ways, including familiarizing ourselves with the lands, the history, the culture, protocols, and governance structure of Indigenous communities on whose territories we are engaging, making time to build trusting and personal relationships with Indigenous leaders and community members, ceding power and space for Indigenous people to lead engagements as the organizers and facilitators. Prioritizing reciprocity. As one participant said, colonialism has a history of taking from Indigenous communities, so it is important to ensure that our engagements are supporting Indigenous economic, social, and cultural well-being. Honoring and centering Indigenous knowledge and worldviews in our engagement processes in consultation with Indigenous communities to avoid appropriation or misuse, and building public awareness of Indigenous rights and the impacts of colonialism in relation to the topic of the engagement. So in our guide, we provide more details, more resources, and examples of this principle in our guide. The fourth principle is to engage the internal diversity of the community. This one's a bit of a mouthful, but basically what it means is that we often map different communities we want to engage, like youth or women or newcomer Canadians. However, these identities are not isolated or fixed. They intersect and affect one another and the way we experience a world based on the intersecting identities that make us who we are. So for example, my experience as a young Mexican woman will be different from an older Mexican man with a disability, even though we share the same ethnicity. And so applying an intersectional approach to engagement means to take these differences into account in order to hear from diverse members from within a single community that you're trying to engage. When designing an engagement, it's important to develop a strategic plan for recruitment and perhaps setting a baseline goal for representation based on figures such as census data or other information. Over the course of an engagement, we should be monitoring gaps and asking partners and participants who is missing from the room and trying to continue to reach out. Maybe it means adding an extra session or conducting a survey or doing more specific outreach to particular communities. And when reporting findings, we can continue to apply this intersectional lens by disaggregating data to highlight the differences in findings between communities as well as the areas of convergence, instead of just reporting the themes as if everybody had agreed to them. Practitioners in Canada, if we switch to the next slide, may also be familiar with the Gender-Based Analysis Plus framework, where this image comes from, which has been adopted by the federal government to explore how intersecting identities impact programs and policies they develop. GBA Plus encourages us to conduct further research and challenge our assumptions to understand how different participants may be affected differently in an engagement process. And if you're interested in learning more about GBA Plus, there are a lot of free online resources. There's a training component that we can share in the links after the webinar. Principle 5 emphasizes the importance of working in reciprocal relationship with communities, something that was really vital, as Grace mentioned, in our process of making this report. In our focus groups, we heard that having trusting, respectful, and collaborative relationships with communities is a foundation of equitable public engagement. It's super important to take time to build trust and genuine relationships with community members and organizations before approaching them with an engagement, and to sustain these relationships between projects to develop trust and foster opportunities for further collaboration. Partnering with community organizations to co-create engagements is also very effective in terms of of the way we develop an engagement. Their deep knowledge of community and their established networks can support planning, broaden outreach, and lend credibility to the engagement process. And community members are also often better placed to lead the outreach and the facilitation. They are familiar faces. They are folks who have relationships with the community. It may be much easier to draw that sense of trust and participation when it is a community leader at the face of a project instead of someone who has come in from an organization. Participants also emphasize that these relationships should be reciprocal. We should be asking community about their needs and priorities to ensure that the process and outcomes benefit the community in concrete ways, such as, for instance, offering honoraria to participants or building capacity through training facilitators or hiring local vendors and offering space for community to do networking and self-organizing. Often in our engagement projects at the Centre for Dialogue, in the feedback we hear, the folks are really just excited to be able to be in touch with other community members, other community organizations, the chance to trade cards and hear what other folks are doing in the work. So sometimes that is actually the most valuable outcome for a community. Principle 6 focuses on tailoring engagement plans to the context. As Grace mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to inclusion. Accessibility needs vary over time and between individuals and communities. So it is important to co-create the engagement with community partners and ask people what they need. We should also remain flexible to changing plans, emerging needs, things that happen on the day, as many of us probably know from our practice, and to offer diverse ways to get involved, whether that's online and in person, once we're out of this pandemic zone, offering multiple dates and times, or different ways to express our ideas, whether that's written or spoken, or maybe using the arts. In our engagement, or the guide that we are sharing with this launch, we have a section at the back that goes through a lot of strategies and questions that can help you address barriers, whether that's physical barriers, communication barriers, different options that you can consider as a tool. Principle 7 asks us to commit to ongoing learning and improvement at an individual and organizational level. This was something that was very important for us in this project as well, realizing that we don't know necessarily all the answers, as Grace and Elodie were mentioning, that we're constantly learning and that things are evolving. So teams can develop a baseline understanding and then build capacity over time by engaging in reflection, evaluation, hearing feedback from participants and organizations who are partnering with us, and conducting ongoing professional development. So at the back of our guide, we also offer a list of recommended resources and training opportunities that can support ongoing learning or do deeper dives on engaging particular communities. This principle acknowledges that making mistakes is inevitable, and we heard that it's just important to be transparent about our shortcomings and to propose a plan to address issues in a timely way. It's also important to build communities of practice, such as this one fostered by IAP2, where we can learn together by transparently sharing our challenges and successes. And so we're very eager in a moment to get into the Q&A and hear some of your experiences as well. And the final principle, advancing systemic equity, loops back to that idea that inclusion on the ground in our engagement processes depends on equity at a systemic level. So it's important to recognize the way power, privilege, and systems of oppression, such as racism, sexism, or ableism, impact our engagement processes, the experience of the participants in the room, their relationship with us as facilitators, as well as our experiences in our institutions that we are part of. As engagement practitioners, we can advance systemic equity by establishing equitable hiring practices and workplace cultures to better recruit and retain more diverse staff. We can embed inclusive and accessible practices in our formal policies. For instance, it's becoming more common to do land acknowledgements at the beginning of processes, at least in Canada, or including diverse genders on registration forms. And some of this is becoming embedded in organizational policy instead of just a good practice. sharing power with communities in order to challenge that traditional hierarchy between decision makers and the public. The more we're co-creating, the more equitable the whole process is. And welcoming innovations, recognizing that traditional ways that we do engagement was designed by and for the dominant culture, and the more we innovate, the better we may be able to reach diverse voices. Now, of course, in your community, you may have additional values or principles that are important to equity in your context, and our understanding of these concepts continues to evolve day by day. So these are not a static and prescriptive list, but rather an invitation or perhaps a provocation for ongoing conversation. And on that note, I'll turn it back to Elodie to open up our space for questions.
Thank you, Nicole, for that deep overview. And I want to stress, as Nicole said, this is not meant to be a static document that will just gather dust on a shelf. It will be revised as we learn more, and including learning more from your feedback as practitioners. Before we open to questions, I think we had a third poll we wanted to put up to actually start prompting the questions that you may still have. And I've noticed a few coming up in the chat. So Drew, if you could put that poll up, we will then get started and ask the questions, or try to answer them as best as we can.
So the goal for today is really just to find out, have you learned something new? For many of you, this is a field that you've been involved in for a long while. So are these principles something that you think that are new and that you'll be able to use? And do you still have any questions? Because as Elodie said, we want to prompt those questions right now. This is a great opportunity over the next 20 to 30 minutes to really dive in and learn a little bit more about what your concerns are, and to be honest, to take advantage of the three experts that we have with us. So Drew, let's find out if people have learned something new today, and then we're going to pop right into those questions. So 86% have learned something new today. And for some people, they still have questions as well. So let's see what else we can answer. So Drew, let's just take the slide down. Let's open it up. And then let's get into some of the questions that we have. So I will start with Michelle's question. She's interested in hearing about over-consulting and planning. She's a little concerned that we're doing a lot out there already, and just your thoughts on this, please.
This is a very important question, and I think particularly with communities that are already dealing with a lot of trauma or who have been traditionally underserved. One example I can give is a very simple one. Out here in British Columbia, we have the lovely Haida Gwaii Islands up north of the province, where a large Indigenous community resides. And this community has been asked over and over to be consulted on matters big and small, and it's become a bit of an industry to fly in to Haida Gwaii, do a consultation or do an engagement, and then fly out. Most of the people who go up to Haida Gwaii don't know the community well, do not reside there, and really they're serving, some form of government that may feel very remote to the islands. Either it's the government of the province, which is located south of the province in Victoria, or it's the federal government, which is located in Ottawa. And recently we were part of an engagement with the islands, and I have some friends up there, and I called and I said, would this be a good time to do this consultation up there? And they said to me, listen, we're so tired. We get somebody every week flying in, and honestly, we're struggling right now to provide essential services to our community. We don't want to have another white suit fly in from Ottawa. And it was very clear that they were very tired. So one of the things we discussed with some practitioners is that sometimes we're not aware of what others are doing. So in our case in Canada, because we have different levels of government, what the province is doing might be very different from what the federal government is doing, and we might not be aware of what the others are doing. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And it's a bit of a problem. So sometimes, again, simple solutions, picking up the phone, calling the community and saying, hey, how many times have you been engaged with in the past 6 months? And is this a good time to do this? It's a simple solution, because it will be very complicated to know, if a municipality has been engaging, if a region has been engaging, if your province or your federal government or the local industries are engaging. Everybody's trying to get a piece of the pie. So again, simple solutions: pick up the phone, call the community, find out. But it is a real problem.
Thank you, Elodie. And I'm sure others may comment on that as well. Drew, I just need to just quickly touch base with you from a housekeeping perspective. Can you take back the screen and then not put up a PowerPoint so that we can see everyone's pictures? And just to quickly let you know, I have, for some reason, have just lost the ability to see attendees. So if anyone's raising their hand, if you could just jump in and let us know if anyone's raising their hand as well. So while we're doing that, Elodie, and we've just got somebody's screen back, so we are seeing your screen at the moment, Drew. So if you could take your screen off, that would be great. And we'll get into Deanna's questions. Could you speak a bit more about my apologies, disaggregate? This word, I always have trouble with it, sorry. Disaggregation of engagement data, and if you have any resources that you found useful. We have struggled with the desire to disaggregate with balancing tokenism and the difference between research and engagement practice. Could you speak a bit more about disaggregation of engagement data, and if you have any resources that you found really useful? We have struggled with the desire to balance tokenism and research and engagement practice. So my apologies for just massacring that word. I'm sorry about that.
It is quite a mouthful. I might chime in here. One of the struggles with disaggregating data is based on, depending on the engagement process. If we're doing a big community workshop and there's different folks with different identities in the room, it's very hard to know, who said what. And we're often, at least in our practice at the Center for Dialogue, we tend to take notes anonymously to help people feel more comfortable in the room. A couple of the techniques that we've used more recently, one is if you are doing engagements in different communities, keeping that data separate, whether just having the note sets labeled, of course, with the location. In some processes, we have done exit surveys where we ask folks not only evaluation feedback on the process, whether they found it accessible or useful, but we also sometimes have a portion that's optional where they can choose to identify based on different demographics that are important, and choosing those demographics based on the topic. So an engagement on, I don't know, something related to schools might be different important demographics and something related to the environment, for instance. And so figuring out what those key demographics are using tools like Gender-Based Analysis Plus can be useful. It kind of can help you think about how will this issue affect different people. And then whether it's in registration or in exit surveys, you can ask folks for optional demographic data. And you might even ask them for, what is your top recommendation coming out of this workshop? Or what are your top 3 priorities? And that can help you identify, maybe women had very different top 3 than the men in the workshop. And maybe that's something that will really affect your findings. So that way you can kind of get not only the qualitative data that's often very important through our notes from the dialogues that we host, but also a little bit more quantitative data. Also, of course, if you're doing online surveys, this is easier. And I think, when we are asking for that demographic data, having a very clear, communicating in a very clear way why we are asking that, and explaining to the community we're trying to make sure that we are hearing from diverse voices and that we are hearing the differences and similarities in what is important to different groups. We also, the last tool that I'll mention is we've started doing a lot of our analysis using indeed a research tool called NVivo, qualitative data analysis software, which allows us to theme the findings, even if it is notes written in a long form, and then you can kind of code it based on where it's come from, based on whether it's a particular focus group in a different community. So actually bridging the gap between research world and the engagement world, I think the more we do that, we'll find that there's a lot of tools that are already set up in qualitative research that can help us. And so at the Centre for Dialogue, we're a little bit lucky in that we are connected to a university, and so we have access to a lot of these tools, but I think there are more and more versions that are available for the public use and very accessible as well.
Thanks, Nicole. So I am going to let all three of you know we have lots of questions. So I'm going to try and get through as many as I can here. So the next one is from Ignatius. And then Drew, just to let you know, we will go to the caller that had raised her hand in just a minute. How do you sustain relationships with community groups in context of limited budgets and time?
I might let Grace come in on this one, but a very simple way is if you're working in a particular area, and I'm thinking, for example, we work in Vancouver a lot, so we have this relationship with certain communities here, and we will go back to them for different clients and different engagements. And it is as simple as, even if you don't have the budget from your client, you should, as a practitioner, maintain those relationships. And it is as easy as going out for coffee with people. And I know today that's very complicated in the times of COVID. We don't get that chance anymore. But simple things, checking in from time to time with, a key partner in a community member saying, hey, how are you doing? What's up with your family? It's really basic human connection. And I would say it has to go beyond the call of what your client wants or needs or whatever organization you're serving. So I know, for example, at the center, we've developed long-term relationships with certain community groups, and we will engage with them for clients, or we will go back to them for different things, but we check in on them from time to time. And it doesn't require a huge investment. It's just a phone call, or as I said, drop by for a coffee or a tea. I call it the practice of 100 cups of tea. And this is coming from my culture, where we spend a huge amount of time drinking tea and talking to folks. But I think it does sustain that relationship, and it does indicate how you're genuinely interested in communities' lives, issues, and problems. And it has to be a little bit coming from us. It can't all be transactional.
I was actually going to say coffee too, because I was meeting with someone and somebody said, oh, this is really refreshing, an agendaless meeting. And that actually goes a long way. I think sometimes we are very agendad society and needs everything to be agendad, and maybe taking that out sometimes really strengthens. And while we're in the engagement process, what worked really well is sometimes there are partners just willing to be at the table to share resource. So what I mean by that is just because they're really looking for that space on the table, there are hidden resources that you can really use to make your engagement richer. So from my example earlier, the support that the person with disability needed was probably something that we weren't able to provide with our limited budget and capacity and resources. But because we involved the partners early on in the stage, they were able to suggest ideas that actually brought support staff to the table with the person who needed support. So I feel like there are resources in the community that you can use along the way in the engagement process.
Thanks, Grace. Just a quick note to everyone that is sending in questions. We will be providing these questions to Nicole, Elodie, and Grace after today's session. And if we can, we'll get back to you. So if we don't answer your question right now, please hang tight. We'll do our very best to answer it after today's call. But I'm going to keep going. So from Rebecca, do you have any thoughts to share on communities that don't currently have diversity? What is their responsibility to inclusion and engagement?
That's an excellent question. And I think that's actually a question for us as practitioners as well. I know we often get this conversation in our organizations or institutions that inclusion and equity is hard. It's hard, it's complicated, it's uncomfortable. It means changing things. How do we do that? And how do we sit in that discomfort? And I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves a lot, and we have to be willing to sit in that discomfort a little bit, and unpack the privilege that comes with that. Because I know we all say, oh, we're feeling the pain. This is hard. I'm getting called out because I said something that wasn't right, or I didn't really reflect that community's need really well. And I think we have to put things back in perspective. We are facing a crisis of democracy in all our modern democracies around the world, and that has come out of some of our research at the center. And that crisis is because there are deep inequities in our societies, and some communities are feeling that pain more than others. So putting things back in perspective, me as somebody who is in a position of relative power in a large public institution, who has sufficient wealth to live every day, who doesn't have to worry about clean water or access to education for my children, I can sit in some discomfort around my role in upholding some of these systems. And what is my responsibility to those communities is to make space for them. And sometimes that means also ceding power. And that is a difficult balance to navigate. In some cases when, for example, we were working on the national inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women, I am not an Indigenous woman. And I was working with a group of highly traumatized folks who were going through a very difficult period of their lives. And we were touching on something that was very traumatic for many communities across the country. And part of ceding the power was saying, well, where I normally facilitate these discussions, I was not going to facilitate those discussions. We did hire a group of fabulous Indigenous facilitators, women facilitators, to facilitate those discussions, because that was necessary to ensure the safety of the participants. And where it was a little bit tough for me, because I wanted to hear those conversations, I wanted to sit at those tables, I could not. I had to leave that space open for that community to do it themselves. And we were in the back supporting them. And I think when we think about communities where there's not a lot of diversity, how do you support maybe the little bit of diversity that you have in that community? And I'm going to turn to some of our American colleagues here, because this is something that's quite relevant in a lot of your communities, where communities have become very ghettoized. And where you have maybe a couple of immigrants or a couple of, people who don't identify with the binaries of gender, how do you make them feel welcomed? How do you bring their voices to the table in a meaningful and respectful way? And again, sometimes it's not very complicated. If you think of communities, we all have places where we gather: libraries, public squares, places of faith. How do we make space for people in those arenas? And I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves, how come I never have Muslim people coming at my dinner table, and how can I make space for that? Or, whatever it is, in whatever context. But I think we can all sit a little bit with our own discomfort in order to create that space, because in the long run, that's what's going to make our communities so much stronger, and it will make our democracies work better. So again, what's the bigger picture behind there?
Can I quickly add?
You know what? I really would like to get into some more questions, Grace. No, please go ahead, and then we'll move on. Please go ahead.
Just one sentence, that maybe thinking about diversity as something a little bit more intersectional will help too. That's not just cultural or ethnic, but something more.
So it's interesting that you just used that word intersectional, because for some of us, this is a new term. And for some people on the call today, they're struggling a little bit about what does that actually mean. That might be a very big explanation. So I don't know if you have a short answer to it, and then they can read the document to get more. But maybe if you could respond to that, then we're going to get into the digital divide that exists, especially during times of COVID-19. So if you want to start with intersectionality and then go to COVID, that's fine, or however you want to do that.
Well, I'm going to let Nicole jump in, actually, for this one.
Yeah, sure. well, we can't really get back to that slide, but the best way that I've had to visualize intersectionality comes from that gender-based analysis framework that we mentioned, and we'll share that resource out later, where you see kind of this star shape, and there's, every person, and me, for instance, there's many identities and experiences that make me who I am. I am, by a certain age, I identify as a woman, I'm Mexican on my mother's side, Hungarian on my father's side. He was a refugee. My family was an immigrant family. I grew up in a certain socioeconomic background. I live in a particular place here in Surrey, near Vancouver. The place I work, the education I have, all of these factors impact who I am, how I experience the world, the barriers that I face, which may be different from my brother's barriers that he would face in an engagement process. And so intersectionality, it's a term that comes from a scholar called Kimberly Crenshaw originally, and it's just accepting the fact that these identities intersect, and that's so my experience as a female Mexican will be different from a male Mexican immigrant in Canada. And so when we put that towards engagement practice, it means thinking beyond, we need to engage youth, but thinking, as Grace was mentioning, okay, who is in that bubble of youth? What are different identities that make that up? Disabled youth, youth in care, youth from newcomer backgrounds, and kind of splitting that up.
Thank you. So I know that IAP2 did run a COVID webinar on how to engage people during times of COVID. And so I think we'll send that out as well for people that are asking about how do you do that in an inclusive fashion. But as well, Elodie or Grace, anything that you're doing right now, because I know that you're out there and engaging people as well. So any ideas on what and how you're using techniques, tools during COVID time?
So I know a lot of us are relying on digital tools right now, and that question of the digital divide is a big one. And I believe one of IAP2's board members, Susanna Hasnians, has done a lot of work on that, and she can provide a lot of information. But I think one of the sort of the little tips that we've been exploring with different communities, especially the remote and rural communities who have very little access to proper bandwidth to be able to, join in on a webinar like this or on a Zoom call, is finding ways to partner to provide that accessibility. So I know some communities, for example, that I've worked with in Africa, they're exploring the use of providing mobile phones to certain communities so they can use mobile phone technology to do engagement. So, we don't all have to use video tools for engagement. There are other ways. A lot of you are already using them, but how can we actually provide that technology to certain communities so they have access? And that may be partnering, again, with a community group or a philanthropy group that can provide the funding for those digital access tools. But it is a big concern, and I think it will continue to be, especially for us here in Canada around our rural and remote areas.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Jill's question because I thought it was great. What was the most surprising discovery while you were doing this research?
I would say it was maybe the fact that inclusion was not not the way to frame it. I mean, at least for me, we started with how can we include, do inclusive public engagement, and that was a word that we were putting on all our focus group titles, and folks just kept on telling us inclusion is not enough. And the fact that actually inclusion, when we talk about, how do we include diverse voices, it creates an assumption that there's a we and we are not diverse, and that we are getting to choose who we are inviting into the circle. And so it's kind of creating that that dynamic where there's a center and then there's the marginalized or the diverse who are out there somewhere, whereas equity really talks about balancing the systems. But I'll open it to Grace and Elodie about what they might.
That was a pretty big one for sure. We ended up changing the title of the report just because of that finding.
No, I think another surprising finding is more around the strategies that practitioners use to respond to this question and how often simple they are. Again, there's nothing really new, or we're not reinventing the wheel with a lot of these principles or strategies. These are things people have been doing for a long time. And I know a lot of folks on this call, you're practicing this in your day-to-day work. So it's about, it's really about that human connection and how we foster it and how we make it stronger and how we use it in a really good way. So I think, again, not framing this as a too complex an issue, but actually an issue of human connection.
Thank you. A quick question from Lucienne. Can you talk about how you choose terms and language that does not, in quotation marks, other communities or put groups into boxes? There is some pushback on, in quotations, marginalized or in quotations, underserved. So your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say ask the community how they want to be framed. And this is relative to any form of engagement. When you frame an issue or you frame your language or whatever documentation you might be providing to a certain community, go and ask them if this is the language they understand, if this is the language they recognize, and how they want to frame it. Because sometimes co-framing an engagement with the community will be you'll get much better results anyway. So I think even in the terms that we use, asking the community, what terms do you recognize that are, how do you want to be, I don't want to say labeled, but how do you want to be spoken about? That's important. And I think many communities have said, this is the term we prefer. And again, I'll come back to Indigenous communities, understanding if they prefer to use Indigenous, if they prefer to use First Nations in some cases, or Inuit or Métis, that's really important. So again, coming back to them and saying, how do you want to do this?
Thanks. The ask, and you'll be told. So very, very important. I think we all need to remember that. Listen and ask. I think two keys for a good public engagement practitioner. Drew, I'm just coming back to you. Did the individual want to speak? Drew?
Let's find out. I've got Camille who's had her hand up, and Camille, you are self-muted. So there we go. Camille is. Do you want to click again and unmute yourself?
Am I unmuted now?
Yes. Hi, Camille. We can hear you now.
Hi.
Thank you.
Hi. So I just have a general question. So I'm in the process of, I work for city government, and we are trying to create a public participation plan. So part of this process is including, all of the constituents in the city, but in our particular city, there is a huge digital divide. It's a lack of access to technology, a lack of understanding technology, and also a large number of people who are limited English proficient, right? So how do we make sure they're sitting at the table and they can participate?
So again, I would say partnering with community groups, that's, I think, an essential step, because they will give you some strategies. And those can be as simple as, sending translated materials using snail mail, because maybe that's how people have better access, using public library spaces if you have them. Whatever strategies community groups will suggest, I think will help you get that reach. So again, the partnering, I think, is really, really key. We can't go at this alone, especially if you have a large municipality where you'll have multiple constituencies with multiple different needs. And I think this lack of access to technology is a big issue that we have to figure out. As well, we have to take into account that certain groups might have literacy issues, as you said, language issues. Do you need to have everything translated into what languages? Those are questions I would ask really early on to your community partners to help figure out.
If I can chime in, there's an example that the guide that we'll be sending out includes some case studies to give kind of like real world examples. One of them talked about a recent project we did on housing here with the city of Burnaby, and one of the really useful outreach methods was having community ambassadors. We're essentially a group of 10 youth who we asked them to engage community where they found them, where they were through their existing networks, at bus stops, in coffee shops, their families, community groups that they were part of. And so there can be different ways to have kind of more of a grassroots approach as well.
And setting a clear standard or threshold, and being really transparent about it in the beginning. This is not the perfect answer, but City of Vancouver has set a policy in translating documents if a certain population goes over a certain percentage in a community, and they made it really clear that that was their limitation, and started doing the translations that way.
So can I follow up in the era of COVID? Do you know how people are addressing this? Like, how are they engaging people?
I think that's a tough question. I think we're all experimenting right now, but I've heard colleagues on webinars recently talk about using, as I said, mobile phones a lot, because where people might not have access to a computer, there is a higher access to mobile. So using mobile phone devices, old technologies like phone trees, that used to be used, I think, many years ago, and we kind of walked away from it. That's coming back because apparently that's quite an efficient way to reach out to people. Telephone town halls, things like that. And again, snail mail, can you pop something into somebody's mailbox that they will be able to access and send you back, with pre-postage return envelopes or something. So I think people are experimenting right now with a wide variety of tools, and I would just keep an eye out for all the wonderful webinars that are put out by practitioners. I know folks at Ethelo or MetroQuest have been putting out a lot, and they're very interesting to watch because it's people doing it right now, experimenting and sharing what they're learning as they're going through this. But I think, unfortunately, we're all in experimentation mode right now with COVID, and it's, we're going to get some of it right and we're going to fail. So I think also giving ourselves permission to fail a little bit in this experimentation phase is important because, again, it's not going to work all the time, every time. And again, being transparent with the community. We're trying this out. We don't know if it's going to work. Give us your feedback. Let's do this together.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And we really will make sure that we include our webinars where we did go into some discussions on that. And also we have a webinar coming up June 9th, which is going to be all about online engagement and how do we do that. So, we're going to be welcoming some of our presenters from our Charlotte conference to come in and talk a little bit more.
I think we might have lost Amelia.
Yeah, Amelia, I think you just frozen up on us there, but I know that Amelia was going to be talking about the upcoming webinar where we're bringing together presenters from the conference we had last year in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they're going to be on hand to do an online engagement masterclass. So that's Tuesday, June the 9th, coming up at 11 o'clock Pacific time, 2 o'clock Eastern. Amelia, are you back with us yet?
I am. I'm sorry, I seem to lose my microphone.
But
can you see me?
You got like this groovy video, man.
Okay. Can you see me now? Are you all right?
I think it's coming back slowly.
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, I am going to turn off my camera and just put on my voice because we've only got a couple more minutes. Drew, is everyone still there? Because I lost everyone's cameras.
All of our presenters are still with us. So Elodie, Nicole, and Grace are still with us, and still people online listening in, and still some questions to go through.
All right. Well, I'm only going to ask one more question. However, we will ensure that that we send all of the questions to Grace, Nicole, and Elodie so that they can take a look at them. The question that I'm actually going to ask is that one of our biggest barriers to inclusive participation into practice is the cultural shift that needs to happen with our internal staff and leadership. This is tricky. Carla's given a very long question, but I'm just wondering if that's something that you could quickly respond to before we sign off for today.
Yeah, I think the cultural shift it's a big question. And as I said, it may feel painful at times for organizations or institutions to go through that. I would say if you're a person pushing for that change, keep pushing. And I also found it very useful to bring in different trainings. So again, Nicole mentioned one of the principles is about ongoing learning. We're not going to be perfect right away. I don't think any of us can expect that. That will never happen. But committing to learning and to improving over time, I think that's really key. So whatever professional development you can bring into your staff, you know, excellent speakers do lots of webinars on these topics all the time. So encouraging people to attend those, being part of conferences. I was at the Charlotte conference in North Carolina last year. There were some excellent presenters that actually spoke to that topic quite a bit. So I think all those opportunities we have to learn and share, and also, as Amelia was saying yesterday when we were chatting, being vulnerable with each other about how we're grappling with these issues. I think that's important, but keep pushing, keep pushing.
And using case studies. We actually ran into that challenges too, and that's why we started collecting case studies to actually strengthen the principles. A lot of the practitioners have told us that using case studies with their bosses created that shift, like one bump towards the change that we're wanting. So we will be continuing to collect cases and sharing it with our practitioners. So if you have any stories to share or cases, please send them our ways as well.
Excellent point, Grace. And I want to reiterate, we'll be sharing our emails with you, and the conversation doesn't stop here. So please come and have a cup of virtual tea with us. Share your story, share your questions with us. And if you have a really good case study, we would love to highlight it. We will be producing a case study book in the coming year, regrouping a number of these case studies that will be like practical applications of these principles. And I think the more we are able to share that around, I know a lot of you are doing this in tremendous ways, and we're really curious to hear back from you.
Well, with that, we're going to bring this to a close. So many questions, so much interest. This was the launch of your new initiative, and so hopefully you feel rejuvenated. Nicole, I love the fact that I'm still seeing you smiling and happy and exuberant on all of this. It was a real honor for IAP2 to be able to host this launch for SFU. As you can see from everyone responding, it's been very well received, and there's still lots more questions. So for those of you that I didn't get to with the questions, as I said, we will make sure that we respond to them. The recording, the materials, the new reports will be coming out within the next 24 to 48 hours. So please, just a little bit of patience while we make sure that we are getting to everything that you want. We're super excited at IAP2 to be able to host this. Very excited about our collaboration. And just before I forget, want to remind everyone that Tuesday, June the 9th at 11 Pacific is that next Charlotte Encore, which is online engagement. Certainly a hot topic for P2 during these times of COVID-19. So please go to your IAP2 wherever you are and register for that webinar on Tuesday, June 9th. Grace, Nicole, Elodie, congrats! Super exciting. Really, really great job. Thank you for today. We look forward to hearing more, and I know we absolutely look forward to sharing all of these materials with our participants that are online and for people that will be just listening to the recording as well. Great work.
And thank you to IAP2 for hosting us. Et pour nos participants francophones du Canada, je voudrais aussi vous dire qu'on essaiera de faire un webinaire supplémentaire en français dans les semaines qui viennent.
Excellent. To everyone, thank you for joining today. Really appreciate it. Happy learning.